So the Doug Hurst that we have today joined in 1960 and initially trained as a radio mechanic. Did his nav training 62, 63, then went to 10 Squadron in Townsville on Neptunes, operating mostly in the Southwest Pacific. Then Butterworth, Malaysia with Transport Support Flight in 1960, 68, 69. Visited Singapore, East Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Cambodia, Laos and Vietnam. Sounds like a bit of a travel, travel feast there, Doug. P3 Orions in Edinburgh, operating in the Indian Pacific Oceans and areas to our north until late 72. School of Air Navigation for the advanced nav training. My dad, Doug, did the #1 advanced nav training course, so there you go. And he was did instructor duties until mid-1976, went posted to 34 VIP Squadron. Back to Orions with 11 Squadron until 1981-82, posting as Chief Instructor Air at the Australian Joint Anti-Submarine School at Nowra. From there, Staff College in 83. And this one, you must have been delighted with this next posting, Doug. Staff duties in personnel plans, resources and management reform. I bet that was exciting after all those years on P3s. He retired as a group captain, was awarded, was made a member of the British Empire in 1993 and worked on and off with the reserve until the mid-2000s. And I know Doug has always been part of a team that have gone to the Australian Command and Staff course each year, presenting with a presentation called, what was it called, Doug? A Flight of Eagles. What was it? What did you call that?
Well, that's what the college called it. Yeah, it was two days where we got people from various things from World War II, various exercises and modern day to come in and talk about what they did.
Yes, yeah,
it was great.
Yeah, it was. Now he's not to let retirement stop him from doing things. He's written 2 books for the RAAF, The Part-Timers and Strategy and Retd. Then 2 on spec, The Fourth Alley and The Forgiven Few, still in print, I understand. And some biographies for friends and numerous articles for Wings magazine, which is of course the official magazine for the Air Force Association, including his time with the Transport Support Flight, which is the basis of his talk today. So thank you, Doug, and thank you for being here. And ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd ask you to perhaps, first of all, put your screens on mute, and then perhaps turn off the videos as well, so that we can then see Doug's presentation. We're off.
Good morning, everyone. As you can see, the talk is about the Transport Support Flight when I was there, 1968, 69, and there's quite a lot about the Cold War. We travelled around the region and it was happening everywhere. Transport Support Flight was a light transport outfit based in Butterworth in the 60s and 70s. It began as sea flight of #2 Squadron, the Canberra Squadron that was there, but when the Canberras went to Vietnam in 67, it was renamed Transport Support Flight and had slightly different tasking arrangements, but otherwise it was the same. We had 6 Dakotas, 5 were basic transports, and 1 had airline seats and a bit of extra soundproofing. They were old, but they were actually very well maintained and pretty reliable. The only problem was they were pretty slow. Now, this talk is a mixture of memories with some recent research. It's not a complete history. As far as I know, there is no history of Transport Support Flight. But this is just some memories and some relevant facts. We were in the middle of this particular map where the Malay Peninsula comes down. This was our main beat. We went to these countries. We went to Malaysia, up and down Malay Peninsula a lot. We went across to South Vietnam a lot, Thailand, Laos, bit of Cambodia and Indonesia. We didn't go to Burma, although TSF did, I didn't. And of course, we didn't go to North Vietnam and China because they were the enemy at the time. Our tasks were these: to support Australian regional forces. We carted the guys and the spares and so forth backwards and forwards to Singapore when the Mirages did detachments down there. They did quite a lot of work with the British forces down there. We supported the RAAF forces in Vietnam, mostly by carting people, spares and stuff backwards and forwards, and guys on R&R, and the Australian Army in Malaysia. We did support for the government in the region. with visiting officials. And the best thing we did was doing diplomatic tours of various countries to take the ambassador and his staff around in visits to their countries, usually 4 or 5 days. And we did support for Malaysian security forces, which was primarily supply drops. This is a modern tourist map. The causeway, the yellow streak in the middle of it, wasn't there at the time. We had a ferry that went across from Georgetown to Butterworth, but otherwise the geography is obviously still the same. And you see that Penang's got an international airport down the bottom here, and it was there at the time. So it was quite a modern place. Now, Butterworth was largely mirage based, and under the nose of that closest aircraft, you see an air base right on the side. And that one, that's Butterworth. And underneath is Georgetown. There were 2 squadrons there, 3 and 75. And north to the top of this picture, we lived in behind those hangars. We had a crew room there, but our aircraft were down the other end of the base because that's where the maintenance squadron was, and that's where the air movements was. We were part of FIAF, Far East Air Force, which had the RAAF, the RAAF, and ZAF. Now, the Brits had quite a few aircraft there at the time, mainly based in Singapore. The most impressive of them was this thing. Now, this is obviously not Singapore, but this is the English Electric Lightning. This thing was a Mach 2.5 aeroplane. It had been designed to do high altitude intercepts on high-flying bombers. Bombers had stopped flying at high altitudes because their missiles were too good and they flew at low level. So it didn't really have a task anymore, but it was incredibly impressive. And when the pilots wanted to put on a show, they used to hold it down. It used to rotate at about 160 knots usually, but they used to hold it down to 250 and then climb vertically out of sight, and they'd disappear in less than a minute. They actually climbed like this, but it didn't matter. It was incredibly impressive. Another interesting aircraft there was this. Now, this one is a transport version of the HS-748s we had here for years. Good little aeroplane. It's called the Andover. This one's got New Zealand Air Force markings on it because the Brits sold them to the Kiwis later. This aircraft's notable for a number of reasons. Firstly, they did the same sort of work as we did for the Brits. It was more suitable for the job because it was air conditioned and had a weather radar and it had turboprop engines that made it a bit faster. But what made it really notable was the camouflage. When the decision was made to send them out to Malaysia, somebody in England said, oh, we'd better camouflage them. And they got their camouflage mixed up and they put desert camouflage on it. And they put it on with a newly developed acrylic paint that you can't get off. And so they flew around over the jungle like this. They had some other important visitors like the Vulcan. This is an amazing airplane if you've never seen one. They came out to Malaysia to do low-level bombing because they weren't flying at high altitude anymore. If they had to deliver bombs, they'd be doing it at low level. And they did sorties out over the jungle. A fantastic machine. Also, this one is the Hanley Page Victor. It had been converted into a tanker. You can see the probe on the front. But actually, the most important visitors for us, for these guys, was the C-130E. We'd only had them a little while in the Air Force, and they had a lot more range than the previous ones, and they could fly direct Butterworth to Richmond. They brought, we came in 2 or 3 times a week, brought in supplies and people and all sorts of stuff. And they went backwards and forwards to Vietnam too. But the most impressive thing they did, they flew medevacs from from Butterworth to Richmond, mostly from Vung Tau in Vietnam. Now, what happened with the medevacs is if a soldier was injured and they'd send out a chopper, which was called a dust-off chopper, to pick them up, and they'd bring them into Vung Tau, where there was a hospital, rather like a MASH unit. And if they could fix them there, they did. If they couldn't, they'd get them ready to be medevaced to 4 RAAF Hospital over in Butterworth. If they could fix them there, they did. If they couldn't, they put them in the C-130 and they went down to Australia in a capsule that had been developed at the on the base at Richmond, and it was sort of an intensive care capsule. This was a very impressive thing. It was the longest medevac in the world. It was pretty impressive stuff for all the people involved. It's pretty well forgotten nowadays, and it shouldn't be. So that was the Air Force world we lived in. As with all aviation, we had to cope with a combination of weather and terrain. This is a map of the Malay Peninsula, and the brown bit down the middle is the hills. Now, they went up to about 7,000 feet. And there's a lot of bad weather if you're flying around an old aeroplane with no weather radar. Because we didn't have weather radar, we only flew at night in emergencies. And we're often forced by cloud to fly seawards here, and we'd go up the Malacca Straits just off the coast rather than over the land at times, and when we're coming back from down south. One time there was a long line of cloud, I hope this works, somewhere around here, which is where Ipoh, the tin mining part of Malaya was. And there was this big line of thunderstorms along, and we didn't have the weather radar, of course, so we just eyeballed it and headed through this map, hit severe turbulence, went up to 18,000 feet in very short time, then hit the downdraft on the other side, spat out the bottom at about 8,000 feet over all the tin mines. You can see them below us. Anyway, the bloke flying the aeroplane said, "Oh, that's good, we're okay. We can go home now." And he put on power, and there wasn't any. The props were windmilling in the slipstream, but we were not going anywhere but down. And suddenly the the starboard engine spat out a bit of flame and started, and the port engine did the same. We went home and looked up the books, and it said, whatever you do, don't close the throttles entirely or the carbies will ice up, which had happened. Turning to the supply drops, they were up in the mountains around here because what had happened is the communist terrorists had been defeated everywhere else, and they'd driven up into the mountains. The CTs had tied up a force of 500,000 men in the 50s. They're now cleared from all the civilized areas and were driven up in the mountains. You can see behind these two handsome chaps, there's the aircraft. You can see it had two doors. One is open here and the other one's closed. We took both doors off, and a specialist army team used to prepare all the stuff dropped to the police force in the mountains, and then they would launch them on a signal from the cockpit. It was unbelievably noisy down the pack without the doors on, and I used to go down the back. We were all strapped in, of course, with a long lead and so forth, just in case they couldn't hear. And I'd give them a big thumbs up when I heard, and they'd hurl this stuff out on a message from the cockpit. We flew in the morning before the cloud built up. You often had a lot of cloud in the valleys, though. And a lot of the mountain streams were like this. And what the Army, Malaysian police used to do is build a fort if they could find a big gooseneck, and they could put the fort there because that gave them a bit more protection, harder to attack, and it was easier to find from the air. Now, the combination of height, about 6,000 or 7,000 feet, high humidity, and the all-up weight, and the fact that during the drop you'd be going reasonably slow, meant that we couldn't maintain height if we lost an engine. So we always made the drops downhill. And I never had an engine failure. I did a number of these. I was never in an engine failure. There was one in some years. But mostly we just did light transport stuff up and down the Malay Peninsula to Kuala Lumpur, Singapore and back, and up backwards and forwards to Vietnam. Occasionally really special things came up. And one was when we went to Brunei to visit the Shell company that was getting oil out of there to take the cricket team across to play their cricket team. It was there that I met the Python Strangler. The python involved was one of these, a Malaysian tree python. And the Strangler was the barman in the Shell Club. Now, this guy was a middle-aged fella, broad-shouldered, very fit and muscular bloke, very cheerful. And what had happened to him is he got in his boat to go around and check his fish traps, and one of these things had dropped from a tree above him and tried to strangle him, obviously. And he wrestled this thing and strangled it and took it back in his boat. And there was a picture beside the bar of a newspaper article that said, "Man strangles python." And there was the barman in the middle of three guys holding up this 2.5 metre python. And then I noticed that he had little blue tattooed dots around his neck. And I said to one of the shell guys in the bar, what are the dots on his neck? And this bloke said, oh, they're the heads he took during the war. So you can gather this guy had no trouble keeping order in the bar. But most of our work was backwards and forwards down the west coast down here, backwards and forwards to either to KL or to Singapore. There was an established air route that was very good, actually. The beacons on the way down, we had a TACAN at each end, we had radar vectors at each end, so it was really quite good. And it all worked very well. And that had to when you got to Singapore, because Singapore, those days, this is a World War II map, Kalang's gone, but all the other airfields were still operating. And that is about the same size as Canberra City. It's not very big. And the traffic was huge. Right? Now, Singapore is a great place to visit. It was, as now, the most progressive, modern and prosperous part of the region. And you could drink the water, you could eat food. It was quite a safe place to be. And we got $3 to $1. It was great to go to Singapore. It was a maritime hub and an ultra-modern port, which it still is. The most important airfields were Changi. Changi was then the main RAAF transport hub for the region, and it was a fully equipped base. It could handle permanently based squadrons or detachments or people like us who just blew in for overnights. The best thing about it, as far as we were concerned, though, was Changi village. The village right that had grown up near the town was an excellent place to visit. There were a few little cafes and stuff, but the best thing, you could buy nearly anything in Changi. And we used to joke you could buy anything from a watch to an elephant, but you had to order the elephant a day ahead. No one bought an elephant. Another major airfield was Pile Eagle. This is a rotten picture, but it does show you this was a thoroughly modern airfield. This was the international airfield, and it had everything. The other main airfield was Tanga, and this is where that lightning that I showed you earlier was based. I think that Hunter's there as well from memory. And all this in tiny Singapore. Happily, the air traffic control was quite outstanding. The Brits had designed the system and were handing over to the Singaporeans. There were standard in and out procedures from the north and an outstanding radar vectoring and approach until handover to local control. The air traffic chatter was constant. What would happen is coming in at about 80 miles, we would start descent. They would call us, Australian Air Force, whatever our call sign was, do this. We would acknowledge, they would say, break, break, and then they'd talk to someone else. It was just constant. It flowed all the time. And I was told the way they did this is they had people working in pairs with a radar screen. One guy would work the problem, the other guy would work the radars, the radios, I mean. And when, after about an hour, they'd rest them and put another pair in. Now, I don't know if that's how they did it, but it makes sense. They did something because it worked really, really well. Most impressive. We also, pushing the wrong buttons here. We also flew people backwards and forwards to Vietnam. This is a modern map of Vietnam, just to let you see how big Vietnam is actually. It's a very thin country, but it's very, very long. It's quite big. And the southern part of it is actually quite big. South Vietnam was quite big. The 17th parallel, which divided north from south, was in the middle of that picture. Here's a map from the war days. You see up the very top of it, there's a black line. That was the demilitarized zone. That was the border. We went mostly to Saigon, Vung Tau, where the choppers and caribous were based, Phan Rang. But I went as far south as Kon Son Island and as far north as Da Nang. The Australian Task Force was here in Phuoc Thu Province. The aircraft were down here, and that's the town of Vung Tau. Now, things you may have heard of is here, which was the Army Forward Base, which was a helicopter pad and so forth, at Nui Dat. Nui Dat means little hill, and they had a fort there. The other place you might have heard of was Long Tan, where the big battle was, and it was associated with Nui Dat. But most of the Air Force stuff, we're all down here. Now, the main town had been, before the war, it had been a large French resort area and had lots of nice villas, and it was rather a nice place, although it was overcrowded now. It was much attuned to the needs of servicemen, I need say no more, on R&R, and it was the main R&R in country place. It was also rumoured that the Viet Cong used to use it for R&R, and they would just put on some civvies and go in and have a few beers in Vung Tau, and probably misbehave in other ways. Air Force people had lived in town initially, but they all lived out on the base. The RAAF aircraft that they had there were the Iroquois and the Caribou. This is the Iroquois, splendid aircraft for the job. They're now sort of regarded as the Dakota of the helicopter world. They're still flying some of them. The Iroquois tasking was mostly in Phuoc Tuy province, and it included medevacs, and which were called dust-offs, and they saved many lives. And as I said to you before, what happened, these guys would be taken to a hospital, which was rather like a MASH unit in Vung Tau. They'd be worked on there, and they'd finish up for RAAF hospital in Butterworth, or perhaps they'd finish up all the way back to Australia. They also inserted and extracted SAS elements. Both activities were very dangerous, and they often attracted fire, and often the aircraft got hit. The Caribous, on the other hand, they went all over South Vietnam, and they were an ideal aircraft for the job. They could handle short strips in the mountains, and they were basic, worked very well. They too got shot at quite a bit, and they got mortar fire. I think we lost one or two mortars when they were parked. Someone lobbed the mortar on. We also flew people and freight across to Phan Rang, which is here. And that's the airfield at Fort Phan Rang. It was a big modern airfield. The airfield is still in use today. I was there about 3 years ago on a holiday. Phan Rang has become a major tourist destination for that part of the region. It has a nice winter, much balmier than the winters in the north. But the rest of it, of course, has been fully developed. It's got a modern terminal and so forth, and the town is completely built. Now, it had an interesting setup, which I didn't realise they used, but the Americans did use. They put a perimeter fence around the base, and then they put another fence outside there. So there were two fences. Anyway, I'll get back to that in a minute. This was the home of some F-100s, our Canberras, and you can see the quality of the revetments and that there. This was a well-organised base. And the American Martin Canberra, which had a new cockpit put on the front of it. Now, the Republic of Korea, their troops were responsible for the area around the base. But patrolling between the two wires, the inner one and the outer one, was done by our air defence guards and American air defence guards. Now, our ADGs were actually part of 2 squadron, first time ever. I saw them in action one night. The base was huge, and the perimeter fence on the other end of the base was being attacked. The area was lit very clearly by parachute flares from a transport aeroplane flying around, hurling these things out. And it was being assisted in the defence by F-100s taking off from the base. 8-minute, 10-minute sorties. They'd take off, hack left, do a bit of bombing and strafing, go back and rearm and do it again. And then suddenly one of them ground to a halt in the middle of the strip. He touched a brake or something, and whatever he'd done, he'd blown a tyre. He wasn't going anywhere, and all the flying stopped. And suddenly this helicopter came over, dropped all this white foam on top of the aeroplane and the pilot, and then a big machine like a bulldozer came, pushed it all aside. Flying started again. It was extremely impressive. Very impressive. Another impressive United States Air Force effort was Tan Son Nhut. Tan Son Nhut was the international airfield at Saigon. It was also a big military airfield, and it was unbelievably busy. They averaged less than a minute between movements, and they didn't fly that much at night. So during the day, minute movements in and out, half a minute, quite common. To take off, aircraft would simply line up in a taxiway, and as the one in front took off, they just have a look, and as soon as he cleaned up, they'd take off themselves, and they just a constant stream of aircraft taking off like that. Landings were conducted much the same way, with the sort of separations you would never use. Taxiways were crowded, and this is a picture from those times. And this is the parking areas were like this. Now, a friend of mine, Mick Hacks, was a chopper pilot. Mick was there one day, and he managed to get an invite up to the tower, and he couldn't believe it. There were aircraft flying around everywhere. And he said to the bloke running the thing in the tower, "How do you blokes control this?" And this guy said, we don't actually control it. We just sort of referee it. Well, whatever they did, it worked. Given the traffic densities and the weather and all the other problems, there were actually very few incidents and accidents in the circumstances. We also did ambassadorial tours during the war. And I did one of these and went as far south as Constant Island and as far up here as Way, and a number of places in between. Now, this was possible because South Vietnam is actually a big place, and the war was sporadic and it was spread out. And most of the airfields we used were very well protected, like Phan, or most of the time. We went into one that wasn't, but otherwise they were all very good. That's South Vietnam. Turning now to Thailand. It was always popular for much the same reasons as today. My first visit was to fly people around on a Seato exercise, and we were based here in Gov't, in the middle of this picture. Gov't. We soon found out that Gov't was one of 6 huge USAF bases, and they're all shown here. The Thai decision to allow the bases in their country followed civil war in neighbouring Laos, and of course the communist takeover of North Vietnam. The Thais didn't want to become communist, and so they obviously decided the best thing to do was to let the Americans build all these big air bases. I visited all these bases except Utapaya down the bottom. Utapaya was where the B-52s were. It had 14,000-foot runway, so they could bomb up and still get airborne on hot tropical days. Don Muang, just above it here, was an international airport, absolutely modern, twin runways, but it also had lots and lots of military airplanes there. We were here at Gov't, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We had Sabres here at Ubon. Sabres here at Ubon, and there were F4s there by the time we got up there. Tackley, I think, had F4s. Sorry about that. I'm not sure it was in the others, except in the Confrontation up there, up here. It had a very interesting little squadron of night forward air controllers who flew in twins with 2 guys and a whole bunch of infrared detector stuff. Gov't had 3 squadrons of these things. It's hard to believe this airplane was conceived in the 50s and built in the early 60s. It was an amazing machine. It could carry 14,000 pounds of bombs. They usually carried about 8,000 pounds. It had a very effective gun, and it had rockets. And there were lots of them. And it was just as well there were lots of them, because they were losing them in large numbers. We're absolutely amazed when we got there and talked to the guys flying these things. They said, "We're getting shot down all the time. We're losing guys all the time." And they were going into the north, in the Red River Valley. And when they got there, they were met by Russian ground-to-air missiles, MiG fighters, which were very well flown, radar-controlled anti-air guns, and just ordinary ground fire. And they went back and back to the same place. And they were losing a lot of aeroplanes. Now, this is what happened. We didn't know anything about this. There was nothing in the papers. It wasn't secret in any way. It just wasn't reported. It was incredible. F-105s flew the most sorties during the war. They lost 283 in combat. And a lot of other smaller aircraft, of course. But the Army lost a lot with choppers and so forth. Now, to try and cut back on this, the USAF had put this thing up. It's an old Super Connie, as you can all see, but it was full of blokes with a lot of electronic snooping gear, and they'd fly up and down along the border trying to learn as much as they could about the air defences and the communications of that in North Vietnam. And as well as that, they'd introduced the wild weasels. I think it was wild weasels were a comic strip of the day. Anyway, this is a twin-seat 105. and it had radar-seeking missiles, where if someone put a radar on, you could fire a missile which would home in on the radar, and they used bombs and they used guns. They had very little electronic stuff on this thing. They would go in ahead of the bombers and they'd attack the missile sites to take them out. It was effective, it was incredibly dangerous. Right? The later versions had electronic jamming and deception equipment, and you'd have to say they were the the early version of the aircraft we've just bought, the Growlers, which are packed full of all sorts of electronic gear, and they have the same role. They've just got a lot better gear. They reduced the casualty rates to some extent, but when we were there, one bloke in a 105 did a precautionary GCA because he couldn't get power, and after landing he had trouble tackling, so he pulled over to a convenient place and stopped, and he got out and he found he had a heat-seeking missile jammed up the tailpipe, which is why he couldn't get power. And we found out about this when we went over the O Club a bit later, and this guy was near the end of a large bottle of scotch he'd bought to calm his nerves. But Thailand was usually peaceful and pleasant affair, especially when we went to Chiang Mai. Just put this map on again. There's Chiang Mai up there, right in the north. It was a charming old place, beautiful place to visit. It was far enough north to enjoy a winter with cool nights, warm days and low humidity. It was a perfect escape for all of our public servants, and that particularly the others down in Bangkok, which never got cool. And when in the cooler months, they went to Chiang Mai for any excuse they could find, and we had the good fortune to sometimes fly them there. The hotels were first class, the food was excellent, and parts of the old city walls and that were still intact. And you can see here, this picture, that's part of the old city. You can see in the background, there's quite a modern city there. Like all of Thailand, it had plenty of Buddhist temples, and there was plenty of evidence everywhere to back the Chiang Mai tourist promotions then that the prettiest girls in Thailand were in Chiang Mai. They still make this claim. And the reason they do is I think they're probably right. This picture's off the latest website. They look rather like all the girls that worked in the hotels and shops and everything when we were there. But I guess they're sort of the granddaughters of them. Anyway, whether they're the prettiest girls in Thailand or not, they're obviously part of the tourist attraction. So in general, we found much to like in Thailand. This was not so for everybody. We were reminded of this when flying. I don't remember where this was. I only remember the incident. It was somewhere in the northern part. Flying along at our 150 knots, and somebody came up on guard. This phantom came up on guard and said, "Mayday, mayday, mayday, request straight in at battle damage, engine fire." And the controller came back and said, "Join downwind." And this bloke came back and said, "Mayday, mayday, mayday, battle damage, engine fire, need straight in approach." And the controller said, "Join downwind, I have 2 other maydays ahead of you in the circuit." To which the F4 guy said, "We don't have time for that, we're banging out." It was a weird experience because Thailand was a peaceful place. There was no war in Thailand and we were just flying along. Great place. Laos was similar, but different. Like Thailand, it had Buddhist temples everywhere, and it was incredibly hot in summer, really hot, 40s, 42, 43 and so forth. In fact, it got so hot, even Buddha had to have a rest occasionally. Vientiane, the capital, the French legacy was obvious. But the most outstanding thing in Vientiane was this thing. And the Americans called it the vertical runway. This huge temple in the middle of town. You see how small the people are at the bottom. And what had happened is the American government had given the Laotian government enough materials, including concrete, to build a modern international airport with a 10,000-foot runway. So the Laotians built a modern airport with a 5,000-foot runway and built this thing. And although it's a Buddhist temple and it's devoted to peace and harmony, it turned out to be a great place if you wanted to take over the town. You could get up there with a few machine guns, you could run the whole town. You can see it on the web now if you look it up. It's all been painted, but still there. Now, because of the French, it had white streets. And you see the big temple at the end there. It was a bit shabbier than this when we went there, but still had the same French flavour. It was a mixed bag. It had all the good things you'd expect in a French place: wide streets, parks, great bread, wonderful food. It also had a civil war, which wasn't in Vientiane anymore, but it was out in the provinces, and it had drugs. It was the regional drug capital. It had cheap and plentiful drugs. And one visit we went there were all these tall Nordic types there, and they spoke English. We said, how did you get here? And they said, oh, we walked across, we got off a boat in Vietnam, walked. And they were on their way to Kathmandu, which they had heard was nirvana. It was heaven, that's where you could get the drugs. But they got to Vientiane and they found out you could buy 100 marijuana cigarettes for $1. And the other drugs were cheap, food was cheap. And if you had nowhere to stay, you could sleep in the park because it never got cold. Anyway, their money ran out and the Laotians had had enough of them. They talked to the Thais on the other side of the border and they threw them out. The vertical runway wasn't the only misused aid. Australia had given Laotian government 5 C-130s, Dakotas, in very good condition. And the people at the embassy there told us the Laotian generals used them to fly drugs from the Golden Triangle, which was up to the west, down to Saigon. But that said, Vientiane was reasonably safe and home to 2 famous US aviation routes. Now, just to show you, put this map on, so that's Vientiane there. You can see they can fly all over Laos, Thailand, you can go to a lot of places if you're based in Vientiane. And the first of these is very well known, Air America. It was a US government outfit directly supporting anti-communist activities in Laos and Vietnam. Right? Now, basically, what its job was, it was a civilian registered outfit, so it could do a whole lot of stuff and not raise any suspicions or need special clearances that you couldn't do with military aircraft. That is effectively what they did. And that included flying things like this up into the hills and into the country and the countryside where the fight was on to support the anti-communist forces there by landing in these little outback strips. I talked to one guy there who did this for a living. He used to go in at night and land in these little bush strips at night in one of these. The other lot was Continental Air Services. They actually were a commercial organisation and they were based in Vientiane, but they were civilian, not government, but they did much the same work. Now, this was a boon to us because the Laotian government didn't produce any documentation at all. There were no little books to tell you how the airfield, what the airfields were like, or who to call when you got here, nothing. There was nothing. And these guys had built up their own stuff and they'd created all their own support documentation, and that's how you could fly around in Laos. And they used to give that to us. There were no diplomatic tours of Indonesia because it was still in the post-confrontation era. It had just finished. And so our diplomats didn't go on tour. However, when we went there, if we went there, then people there were extremely friendly. They had no problem at all. Now, I went on one tour of Indonesia and it was mostly around Java. And what we were there for is we were with an Australian team to put in an HF radio link all around the islands so that the air traffic controllers could talk to one another. And I found out how necessary this was when I put in a flight plan. I think we were in Bali and we wanted to go to Jakarta. And I put the flight plan in and this guy said, okay, when you get to the top of climb, call this frequency and resubmit your flight plan. And I said, why would I do that? He said, because I can't talk to anybody. They don't know you're coming, and if you don't tell them, they won't know. Just a few thoughts on the whole region. When we did that visit, Indonesia had 90 million people. They got about 3 times that many now. So is Singapore, so is Malaysia, and Vietnam's about to crack 100 million. But the whole region is much more stable and prosperous, thanks very much to the West winning the Cold War. And don't let anyone tell you any different. Now, I was mostly an onlooker to the Southeast Asia struggles, but I would like to acknowledge the efforts of those directly involved, especially those who got shot at, like the infantry guys and the chopper crews, the caribou crows, and all the air defence guards and people like that. There were a lot of people shot at in Vietnam. It wasn't a little tiny war, it was quite big in times. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doug. That was terrific. I'll just get everyone back again. It's great. I'll just view. Thank you very much, Doug. There's no doubt about it that that part of the world to our north has created so much excitement for us. and with various skirmishes and that sort of thing on. But again, it's getting the story from the ground, you know, the everyday experiences, you know, even some of the stories that will never be written about, of course. That sound like a very hairy trip you had that time when you lost part of the starboard engine there, Doug, over the top of that mountain range. So thank heavens you made it. And I love the story about the guy with flying the wild Weasel, who had the rocket up his back. No wonder you saw him having that whiskey at the bar later on that night. And the lovely ladies of Chiang Mai. Yes, I'm sure they're all still lovely ladies of Chiang Mai.
There's one story there, Marianne.
Yeah. Say again?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
With the wild weasels, I didn't have time to put everything. There was one story there. When they created those aeroplanes, they posted all the backseaters in from B-52s. And this guy who'd been flying around in B-52s for some years arrived there, and he said, "What do we do?" And he said, and they said, "Oh, we go in and we attack these radar sites with guns and rockets and so forth." So that they can't operate and shoot. Sorry, I can't. And we go in and we attack these things with bombs and guns. And he said, "You got to be shitting me." And that became the squadron motto for that squadron. And I never heard if this bloke survived his full tour or not, but it was incredibly dangerous stuff.
Oh, yes, yeah. Exactly. Look, and as I say, a lot of those stories sort of indicated while there's obviously a lot of fun there. I mean, it must have been very exciting, but you must have been on the edge of your seat literally many times. You know, just incredible range of stories. I've just made a few notes here. I love the stories of the Kiwis with their camo, desert camo. You know, I bet they never lived that down. God bless them. And I've done a couple of those long flights from Richmond to Butterworth in the C-130s. So they were terrific. So I can imagine, even in those days, with the C-130s must have been good. The number of bases on Singapore, 4 out of 5 are still there. Fantastic! What a great country. The Laotian temple, where they used part of the money to build that lovely Arc de Triomphe that really looked like, you know, down their lovely boulevard. Good on them. Good on them for taking advantage of it. A little bit of corruption there, but who cares? And the fact that you could get 100 marijuana cigarettes for $1. God, what nirvana for a lot of people. Particularly those guys that got caught there. So look, it's terrific. Thank you, Doug. Has anyone got any questions? Just put your hand up or come into the chat. Just put your hand up and yes, Warwick.
Approximately how many hours was it from Richmond to Butterworth direct with Hercules?
Say again, sorry?
Approximately how many hours flight time from Richmond to Butterworth?
Yeah. Doug, how many hours do you reckon?
It was 10 or 12. It was a long trip in a C-130. It had previously been broken at Darwin, where they stayed overnight and went on because it was so far. I'd guess, I didn't do it, but I'd guess it was 10 to 12 hours, which is a lot down the back of a Herc.
Yeah. Speaking as someone who started my career on the C-130E, probably a little bit longer still. I never did it direct, but Darwin is in the direct path.
Yeah. And
you're looking at 6 or 7 to Darwin and then 6 or 7 onwards. So between 12 and 14 hours.
Yeah.
I flew home from Vietnam, courtesy of the RAAF, out of Butterworth, and we did stop in Darwin, but it was only a refueling stop, and then we continued on to Laverton.
When I was based at Air Command, I had the opportunity to do a couple of safe hand runs from Richmond, and we did go via Darwin up to Butterworth. It was great, you know, do a bit of speed shopping, stay overnight, come back. But yeah, after about the second time, someone said, "Do you want to go again?" And no, thanks. It was too much on the Herc. It was great. Any more questions there, folks?
Doug, I was going to say that when you mentioned the ferry, the Penang ferry, brought back a memory.
Yes. Yeah.
I was in Butterworth on the way from Vietnam to go to the UK, and my mate and I went across on the ferry to Georgetown and did all the things that you do in Georgetown. Got on the ferry to go home to Butterworth to sleep and went to sleep on the ferry. We went backwards and forwards and luckily woke up on the last trip into Butterworth. Otherwise, we'd have been back in Georgetown having to stay overnight there. So all those places you mentioned, very familiar to me.
Sometimes.
And the aircraft types too.
Yeah, I was just wondering where you were saying that one time there was the VAF, there was the RAF, the RAAF, of course, and the Royal New Zealand Air Force. Did they have different methods of operating, or was it all sort of very collaborative?
The whole of FIAF had pretty standard operating procedures, and there's a lot of stuff's international. And when you talk about air traffic procedures and everything else, they're everywhere. So once you know one lot, they're the same. You might have a few local variations in airfield control, but they're rare. And in fact, most of the air traffic is pretty much international. It's all controlled by ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Authority, and everybody sticks to it. Vietnam had a lot of local stuff because there's such heavy traffic, you couldn't stick to the usual air traffic separations. If you stuck to the air traffic separations, it wouldn't work. So it was all visual there. There was almost no IFR flight planning in Vietnam. It was all visual, and you had to make it up as you went along. They worked on what they called the big sky principle. There's a lot of sky out there, and the chance of two aircraft being in the same place at the same time is quite small.
Marianne Lance here. Can I just add a couple of comments there?
Yeah, please do.
Having spent 2 years in Butterworth, living in Penang with two Scotland and then in Vietnam, can agree with what Doug says, but we were part of FIAF and we operated under their operating principles, international ICAO regulations as well. In Vietnam, as Doug mentioned it before, one of the air controllers said, no, we don't control aircraft, we just referee it. And it was see and be seen, but it was still had some degree of flight following, but flight advisory information only. But you had to set your own separation, except in the circuit and landing, but that was all heavily controlled. But the Royal Air Force really controlled everything in Singapore and Malaysia. And then in Hong Kong, when we used to go to Hong Kong, it was a real pleasure going to Hong Kong because they were British controllers, they knew what was going on, and exactly the same in Singapore. But it was a nightmare going in some areas. It's good listening to what Doug was saying, because I had a bit of time there, not with TSF, but they were part of Sea Flight in Tucson that I was in. But it was a pleasure living in Penang. It was an exotic place, food, architecture. It was an experience of a lifetime, actually.
Yeah. So I sort of think maybe the flying that our aircrew do these days must be a little bit boring by comparison. So
it's all too controlled, Marianne.
Yeah,
a little bit cavalier in some areas, but
yeah. Well, I suppose at least there's not too much sort of skirmishes going on, of course, like there was.
no.
Yeah. So sorry, Lance. Yeah.
We had to use our own initiative to a large degree in operating in Malaysia and Vietnam.
Yeah.
In Canberras, anyway.
Yeah. And what about the story about the Python Strangler? He sounded like an interesting bloke. I think there's probably characters like that in some of those wild bars right across Asia, ex-Vietnam vets or...
well, closest I came to a Python when we used to go as range safety officer at the Song Song Range out of Butterworth, and there was a Python lived in the ceiling of the range safety officer's hut, and he made a bit of noise at night, so we were pretty wary about that sort of thing, but they didn't come into the room.
Oh, good. That's good. That's good. Oh dear. Look, that was just a fantastic reflection of the excitement of the times, the variation, the air traffic controllers. I mean, boy, did they do a great job. And I love the story about the guy saying, sorry, I can't operate with a Mayday at the moment because I've got two more in front of you. Oh my God. It's just exciting. So I hope the two guys that ended up hanging out, I hope they made it. So exciting times. So any more questions? Yes, Robert. Yes, please.
I was just waving goodbye to Roger, who was heading off.
Oh, right. Oh, okay. Okay. Any more questions there, ladies and gentlemen? Okay. So we're just getting lots of notes up here saying, thank you for a very interesting presentation. The maps help put everything in perspective. So another one there from Ian. Congratulations. Great presentation. Thanks. So look, thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm still working on the program for the rest of the year. I've got a couple more to fill, and then I'll go out with the program for the end of the year. If anyone's got any suggestions or any particular subject matters they'd like to see covered, let me know, and I'll see if I can find a guest speaker for us. And so thank you very much for your participation. So, and have a great weekend, everybody.
Before we go,
Doug. Yeah. Yes.
before we go, Marianne, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can, Doug. Yes.
If anybody wants to know more about this, I wrote an article for Wings magazine some years ago, when Lance Halverson was the editor. It's got a lot more detail in it, same sort of stories, but more of them. And
Right,
we
terrific.
can give that to you. I've got a digital form. If anyone wants it, just get in touch with Marianne and I'll pass it on to you.
Terrific. Yeah, do that, please, Doug, and I can send it out to the friends. Yeah, that'd be terrific. Thank you so much. Okay, then any other comments or goodbyes there, ladies and gents? Terrific. All right, then, well, as I say, thank you once again. I'll get the program out soon when it's complete. And thank you, Doug. That was terrific. And I'll be in touch in the next couple of days. Terrific. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Marianne. Thanks, Doug.
Terrific. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.